Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last messenger of Allah. I would like to share with you, as a beginning, a series on education, on Islamic education and its significance. As in the Muslim world today, there are a number of Muslim schools appearing. In our time, people have come to realize their importance, and so we find, especially in many of the Western countries, US, Canada, UK, South Africa, Australia, etc., an explosion of Muslim schools. And even in Muslim countries, we now find Muslim communities or organizations concerned about Islamic education. In that context, I thought it was good to reflect on the goals of Islamic education and what really constitutes Islamic education. Is an Islamic school merely a building owned by Muslims, run by a Muslim principal, having Muslim teachers and Muslim students? Is that what an Islamic school is? Or are there other issues which go beyond that physical circumstance of Muslim people in a Muslim owned or controlled setting? My contention is that we do have to look at other issues which are of greater relevance, because the idea of education itself needs to be understood from the experience of the West today. If we look at the definition which is commonly used for education in Islam, or education in general, what we find is that education is defined as a society's formal mechanism for the transmission of its culture. It is equivalent to socialization, the process by which persons are acculturated into a human community. So what we're talking about here is not merely the conveyance of information, we could say secular or scientific information. You learn how to speak English, you learn mathematics, you learn the sciences. It is defined as society's way of conveying its culture to the next generation. That's the root. Therefore, it means that the material which is being used can change and can alter the whole face of that Islamic institution. If the material is not itself geared towards conveying the values of Islamic society, then it will not be surprising if the outcome of these quote-unquote Muslim schools is not much different from Muslims attending government schools or non-Muslim schools. So what I'm suggesting is that we have to keep in mind the role of not only the individuals who are involved in this educational process, the staff, teaching, superstructure, and the building, but we have to look at the content itself. In reality, the Muslim approach to knowledge was always a holistic approach, in that there was no separation between what may be called secular knowledge and religious knowledge. That distinction wasn't made, because the basic concept in Islam is that knowledge fundamentally comes from God. So whatever knowledge is acquired in some way should be used in a way which is pleasing to God, so that no separation was made. Sciences were taught along with the religious sciences, the religious fields of knowledge. The two were taught together to create a whole individual whose the importance of their character and moral upbringing and goals in life goals for the life to come were balanced with the importance also of this life and knowledge necessary to make this life comfortable, to be able to benefit from the various bounties which Allah has put in this world. So that approach was, as I said, a holistic approach. Both aspects of knowledge were taught together. It is in later times that this has been separated. So we now find in the Muslim world an abundance of what we may call madrasas, schools where people go and just learn religious information. And the regular schools where people go and learn secular or worldly knowledge. So now, when we set up a Muslim school, if we haven't grasped this problem of bifurcation of knowledge, where knowledge is now split into two areas, and we only set up our school teaching the same texts which are used, imported from UK, US, or whatever, or even produced in the country, but from that secular perspective. These are the books that we use. And then we only have Islamic studies as a particular period in a day, or so many periods per week. Then we have continued to promote this almost schizophrenic approach to learning, where there is Islamic studies period, where we learn Islam, and the rest of the studies where we learn the worldly knowledge, which is going to earn us a means of living, etc., etc. We don't want that to develop in the minds of the children. If that is happening, then we have not achieved the basic goals of Islamic education or an Islamic education institution. It is important that each and every subject be presented from an Islamic perspective, where there is one, or within an Islamic context where it can be put. From an Islamic perspective, for example, if we're dealing with sciences, etc., and we're talking about different elements in biology or physics or whatever, the teacher would introduce in his or her class elements which would remind the students that this is all from Allah. This is all a part of Allah's creation, and they would talk about the subject from that type of a perspective. So while talking about how light can be split into different colors through a prism or whatever, that we're talking about Allah created light in such a way, because if He willed, He could have created it in a way where it doesn't split in this way. So all of these laws, etc., these are all the laws which Allah has put into nature. So when we talk about it, we don't talk about it as something which human beings discovered, and we don't speak about the origin from where it came. So by talking about sciences in this way, we keep the student in touch with his or her religious foundation. There is a link there between the two. So the student doesn't feel that sharp transition between science class and Islamic studies class. In both classes, Allah is mentioned, the greatness of Allah is spoken of, so that common factor exists. Some subjects one might say, well, what about English, or mathematics? English, for example, how do you teach English from an Islamic perspective? Well, the language is the language. We can't deny that the language is from a non-Muslim perspective, but where did language come from? Depending on the level of the knowledge of the students, if you're going to talk about the English language, you can bring the idea that language is a gift from God. So there's a place where that can be introduced. But at least when we're teaching children on a primary level, kindergarten, etc., at least the materials that we're using to teach English, for example, those materials should be presented within an Islamic context, meaning that books for kindergarten are mostly pictures. So what pictures, what images do you show the children? If you show them images that they can relate to, images of Muslim families in a world where there are non-Muslims also, but promoting Muslim values, the language can be taught while at the same time values can be taught. When one looks at children at the age of 4 who are first learning, they're learning English in a pre-kindergarten circumstance. So what kind of images do you show the child? You look into what kind of issues the children at that age have. At that age, children tend to have some kind of difficulty in sharing, for example. Of course, it depends on the families. Families may stress it, and so children are able to share. But the nature of the child is to want to hold things for himself or herself. They don't want to share it with others. So therefore, in your English class, when you're teaching those basic words for the early readers, the images that you put in the background are images which teach the child how to share and the value of sharing. So in that way, an Islamic value, the value of sharing, is taught. The images used of the children are Muslim children, so they can relate to it, where Islamic considerations are met. Books coming from the UK or from USA or Australia or wherever else, where they don't have the same considerations, where kids may be shown with, body parts exposed, or they may be shown, playing with dogs in a way we wouldn't in an Islamic society do. Not that Islam is against dogs, right? So you might even show in the book that you shouldn't harm even a dog, right? So the idea of throwing stones at a dog, chasing away dogs, viciously, really just trying to harm them, this is not a good thing. So you would teach them on one hand that this is not good, but on the other hand, you'd also teach them that the dog should not be made your best friend, in the sense that he's going to sleep with you, you're going to be kissing the dog, the types of things that you find in other societies and which end up in their literature, in the books, and in the images that are presented. So rather than the school spend a month before class begins with these books coming from Western sources where you have to tear out pages, white out things, you prepare your own texts which express Islamic values, which are user-friendly for the children. They feel and they can see themselves in them. So the content is the biggest challenge facing the Muslim world today. We have the structures now, and there are many more going up. We have teachers, principals, administrators. We have all of the extra or the superstructure, but the core of the Islamic school, which is the content which has to be conveyed, this is missing today. Unfortunately, Muslims have spoken about it over the years, books have been written on it, but it remains a theory. And this is the big challenge which we're faced with. So that the goals of education, which we said in the very beginning, to convey a society's values to the coming generation, that the students who come out of the system would be affected by these values. They would have been molded by these values, and they would come out as useful members of society, being able to contribute to promote the higher values or higher human values throughout the society itself. To understand the need today with regards to Islamic education, it is important to understand the position of Muslims with regards to the existing bodies of knowledge that are available in the world today. In the past, Muslims were the leaders in knowledge, in its acquisition and in its dissemination. That's the history. In Seville, in Spain, Andalusia, in Baghdad, these were centers of learning, where people from non-Muslim societies came and sat among Muslims and benefited. Today, we have the reverse. For the first time really in the history of the Muslim Ummah, Muslims are now leaving their lands and going to non-Muslim lands to acquire this knowledge, to gather this knowledge. Oftentimes they go and they stay there. But in any case, there are many who go, take it and bring it back. So we have a new situation. This body of knowledge which is available today is not in accordance with how the Muslim mind or the Muslim world would have presented it. So we have to now go back and analyze this knowledge before presenting it in our educational institutions. So, for example, when we come to look at knowledge, we have to first divide it into two basic categories. What we may call true knowledge, and what we may call false knowledge. Because all of it is called knowledge, as it is taught and presented in different sources. For example, one may ask, what do you mean by false knowledge? Well, evolution as it's presented currently, as being the explanation for our existence and how life came about, etc., we would consider this to be false knowledge. Though at the root of it, maybe the evidence which is used may be true, in terms of fossil bones and these kind of things, these are facts. So the facts of science in this regard, no one can deny. And its gathering, we can say, is a part of true knowledge. But how you read those facts may end up being false knowledge, because if those who are reading it are those who deny God's existence, then they are going to manipulate that information and present it in such a way. So we have to be able to make that distinction. The other idea, for example, where science is actively involved in a cure for death. Money, large amounts of money is spent trying to find a cure for death. But this is something we would say is false knowledge. As Muslims, we would not engage in this pursuit. It is a waste of time and energy, because Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace and blessings be upon him, already told us that Allah has revealed a cure for everything except death. So there is no cure. We know everybody is going to die. There's no way to stop the clock, the biological clock, and live forever. Also, what may be in some other fields we could consider to be false knowledge is the democratic ideal which is taught in some of the areas of sociology, etc., where decisions are made by the people. Right and wrong is decided by people, not by God. So again, what comes out of that, we would have to say from the Muslim perspective, is false knowledge. Because human beings, whenever they set up systems, create laws, etc., they usually do so with some bias. You set up a system, it's going to be in favor of yourself, or in your class, or your caste, or your family grouping, or your tribe, or whatever. This is the nature of human beings to do this. So when you talk about, democracy, where the majority rules, then the minority suffers if they belong to a different caste, class, family, tribe, etc. So certain things of that nature, we have to say, we look at it as false knowledge. And we have to put that aside and focus on what we may consider to be real knowledge. Then, when we look at that category of real knowledge, or true knowledge, we have to divide it, again, we subdivide it into useful knowledge and useless knowledge. Useful knowledge and useless knowledge. Again, somebody might raise the question, what do you mean by useless knowledge? Especially where people are taught to seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge. This is a common phrase and concept which is promoted in Western education institutions or Western influence educational institutions. Knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Whereas the Islamic goal is knowledge for its usage, its benefit. Where there's benefit in it, then we seek it. Where there's no immediate benefit in it, then we leave it, focusing on the areas of clear-cut benefit. Now, the goals, as I said, of education, of knowledge, and the usage of knowledge from the Islamic perspective is one of benefit. The value of the knowledge is in its application, when it is applied. As the Prophet ﷺ had said, خَيْرُ النَّاسِ أَنْفَعُهُمْ لِلنَّاسِ. The best of people are those most beneficial to other people. And Ibn Mas'ud, one of the companions of the Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, had said that they used to learn 10 verses of the Quran at a time and did not proceed until the knowledge was gained and acted upon. He said, we used to learn knowledge and its application together. So the idea of knowledge for the sake of knowledge is foreign in the Muslim context. It is knowledge for its benefit. How it will benefit those students, how it will benefit the society. And of course, the whole process of education, acquiring knowledge and conveying it, has to be within the context of the fear of God. It is a faith-based system. So Islam and its teachings must represent the framework of any educational program. So to wrap things up, I'd just like to stress again that the process of education, one of conveying one's culture to the next generation, has to, from a Muslim perspective, for Muslim schools, reflect Muslim culture and its perspectives. With that thought, I'd like to wrap up this episode, thanking you for being with us and bidding you farewell. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.